Hi class, I'm Jared Thomas. This week I wanted to explore a little more in depth Texas's involvement in the Civil War. Last week my research provided me with some really great questions that I wanted to answer, as well as our discussion board post. Questions that were asked by both Jonathan and Mark really made me curious to find out more information. So this week one of the articles that I looked at was titled Texas, Men for War, Cotton for Economy by Carl N. Tyson. Tyson does a great job in this article of evaluating the contributions of the men who fought from Texas, both outside of Texas as well as inside of Texas, and the generals who defended Texas from the Union forces. The thing that most interested me about Tyson's work was the economic contributions of Texas during the war. The thing that I found Tyson talked about was Texas's largest contribution came in the form of the cattle they were able to supply to the rest of the Confederacy. Tyson stated that Texas's contribution kept the Confederacy fed and kept their soldiers fighting far beyond what other food sources would have been capable of providing. To answer some of the questions that were asked from the discussion board, Tyson stated that Texas's supply of weapons and ammunition and cotton for cloth largely benefited the Trans-Mississippi Department and not the Confederacy as a whole. The contribution of this to the whole Confederacy was that it alleviated the need to provide the Eastern soldiers with these goods. So Texas was able to have a good hand in supplying the Trans-Mississippi Department, but it wasn't necessarily sent out to the entire Confederacy. One of the things I really appreciated about Tyson's article was the methodology he used. Everything is written in a very enjoyable way. It makes you want to read the rest of the article. He clearly presents Texas's involvement in the Civil War from positive and negative sides. He discusses the generals who were in charge of defending Texas, the good decisions they made, their strengths, as well as their weaknesses, talking about how some of their decisions were very unpopular socially and even created a need for the Texas citizens to call for some of their removal. I appreciated this because it reminded me of our biblical worldview principle that a commitment to objectivity and honesty is essential to historical investigation. Tyson utilizes 50 sources for his 18-page article, which was quite extensive. The sources come from primary as well as secondary sources. He utilizes state documents, personal correspondence, journal articles, as well as books to field all the information for the article. And finally, Tyson's conclusion was pretty interesting. He stated that Texas definitely added to the South's prolonged war effort, but that because Texas was never formally occupied by the Union Army, they didn't suffer nearly as much damage as some of our other southern states did. However, the damage they did suffer was the result of the demoralization of their people, the death of so many of their young men, and the financial setbacks of the war as well. The second article I looked at took a much different approach to the involvement of Texas in the Civil War, and it's titled Profiles in Evasion, Civil War Substitutes and the Men Who Hired Them in Walker's Texas Division. This was written by Mary L. Wilson. Wilson talks in this article about the idea of substitutes and explains how the concept in the war was practiced both by the Union and the Confederates, and it extended back to pre-colonial European times. She describes the way that substitutes were viewed by the people at the time. The people who actually fought in the war, the other soldiers, didn't trust the substitutes. Substitutes were often thought of as cowards who would flee when things got too thick. People in society often didn't look very highly at substitutes for those same reasons. They saw them as cowards. She also discussed the way that people viewed the principals, the men who hired the substitutes, as being pretty cowardly themselves as well. The focus largely shifts, though, to better understand who these substitutes were by evaluating John G. Walker's Texas Division in the Civil War. Wilson compares data from both the principals who hired the men and the substitutes as well to try to determine the average ages of the men, the literacy level, as well as various aspects of their economic data. What's really cool about Wilson's work is the approach that she takes to this. It's extremely scientific. She provides a whole lot of data that she delivers in a way that isn't boring to read. It's very interestingly put. It doesn't come across as tedious at all, but it's extremely informative. Sorry about that. She also presents her data in an easy to follow way, breaking down each of the different components finally in charts and tables at the end of her research. Her sources largely rely on the U.S. War Department records as well as the 1860 census data. But she also, in her commentary, relied on some primary sources as well as secondary sources, books and correspondence, as well as state legal codes to back up some of the things she was discussing. The conclusion that Wilson reaches is really interesting because she's very, very, very careful to be clear that her study should not be considered as a representative of the entire Confederacy, since she was only focusing on one division. However, it does provide us with some insight that within Walker's division, it's clear that wealthy men absolutely hired poorer men to fight for them in the Civil War and to take their place on the field of battle. The final article I looked at was titled Civil War Texas, a Review of Historical Literature. So this work is what it sounds like. It's a historiography of Texas's involvement in the Civil War and the people who have written about it. This was a very interesting article and written by Walter F. Bell, who is, at the time of his writing in 2005, the assistant reference librarian and an assistant professor of the Mary and John Gray Library at Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas. It was pretty fitting that a library assistant would write a historiography on the Civil War, I thought. Bell begins with a discussion about the influence of the early works of Civil War historians being largely Confederate in nature. These were people who were Confederate sympathizers. They either were veterans of the war themselves or had family members who had been veterans. So some of the early histories are very slanted towards Confederate sympathies. He does state that more recent works, works that have come outside of the early 20th century, do increase in the quality of the work, and that they've improved very greatly. He explores works that focus on a variety of Civil War in Texas topics, such as battles in the Civil War, strategies that were used by both sides. He talks about the effectiveness of Texas forces, political issues, as well as societal issues such as the people who lived in Texas, the immigrants, and how they felt about the war, as well as their relationship to the Confederacy as a whole and the Union activists who were here in Texas at the time. So a lot of really broad range of topics covered in Bell's article. The methodology that Bell utilizes to present his information is extremely engaging as he presents his historiography. It moves very smoothly from one topic to the next, and it doesn't really seem to be any break in the transitions. It's a very natural flow. It was very seamless, is the note that I made on that. The sources that Bell utilizes are, of course, all secondary in nature as he is presenting a historiography. He does not compile a formal bibliography for the work, but the footnotes that he provides for his work are extremely detailed and very well annotated to provide a lot of great information about the source that he's discussing. The conclusion that Bell reaches is that the historical approaches to the Civil War in Texas topics have not only increased in quality over time, but have expanded in their horizons to explore numerous concerns outside of the war itself, to provide a better understanding of the impact of the war on Texas and Texas society. All three of these articles were absolutely fantastic and really added to my understanding of how Texas was involved in the Civil War. Thank you guys for listening. I appreciate it.